The credibility of Paul is only being brought into question because of the claims of Muhammad, not because of anything Paul or the other apostles have ever said. And Muhammad, when it comes down to it, has zero credibility when it comes to making claims about the historical Jesus, especially when compared to someone like the Apostle Paul. For instance, Paul lived during the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses, and as we read, repeatedly sought clarification with them in order to make sure they were all teaching the same message. Muhammad lived 600 years after the time of the apostles, and of course had no access to even the culture that they were from. Paul's conversion led him to living a morally exemplary life, showing that proves sincerity. You wouldn't note him as knowingly lying. Muhammad's claims of prophethood enabled him to violate every single one of the Ten Commandments with interest. We discussed this when discussing the disgusting life of the man named Muhammad bin Abdullah. And if you want to have a recap of that, I'd be honored. Paul's references and quotations of Jesus were verified by his apostles, who later documented them in the gospel accounts. Muhammad never quoted Jesus once, except for references to fables that he was mocked for. He had the nickname the Ear because he believed everything he heard and was, of course, quoting fables, like the infancy gospel of Thomas, and just basically saying that, well, Jesus said this, I am not a man, I'm only a man, you do not know what is in my mind, and I do not know what is in your mind, talking ironically in Arabic the same way that Muhammad also talked about in his poetry, which was also pathetic. Paul spoke the relevant languages to understand Jesus' message firsthand. Muhammad never even learned Arabic. He could not read or write his own language, and deliberately, for his entire life, emphasized this in his writings. And again, if you see a problem with that, you're paying attention. Paul came from the same culture Jesus' earthly ministry was geared towards. Muhammad was from an Arabic Bedouin culture totally removed from Judaism. Paul was a scholar of the Old Testament under the teaching of the Rabbi Gamaliel. Muhammad didn't know what the Old and New Testament even were, which was unfortunate because he references them repeatedly in the Quran as verification of his writings. Paul affirmed worship of Jesus because he was the true and living God of Israel. Muhammad attempted and affirmed pagan practices like kissing the black stone and circling the Kaaba, not because of revelations from Allah, but because he liked it. In fact, we even have quotations in the Hadith of the successors of Muhammad, his companions, where he said, I would not have kissed you, referring to Abu Bakr, Uthman, Umar. One in particular noted, I would not have kissed you unless I saw Muhammad doing it. I know you're just a stone and can't hurt or help anyone, yet the circling of the Kaaba in this day for Muslims is not only their direction of prayer, but this site of pagan worship is circled 7 times in honor of these 7 celestial deities, which the Nabateans worshipped even during Muhammad's time. Paul was peaceful in his exchanges with non-Christians and never retaliated when violence was committed against him. Muhammad committed mass murder and premeditated assassinations of people for the crimes of writing poetry about him and hurting his feelings. Paul endured persecution that included stoning, lashes, unjust imprisonment for years, all for the sake of the gospel, not his poor behavior, for the gospel's sake. Muhammad, after not preaching Islam, but mocking and deriding their forefathers and traditions, so publicly and personally insulting the families of the people that he lived amongst in Mecca. This is not according to me, this is according to the history of Al-Tabari. He had pebbles thrown at him. He was verbally mocked, and the worst of the persecution that he endured was one time during his prayer sessions, he had camel organs poured on him. Not comparable when you compare that to the kind of life that Muhammad endured, or that Paul, endured, when it comes to the kind of persecution he endured. He was put to the test, not emotionally, but physically. And in spite of his well-being, he was willing to endure those things as a demonstration of how committed he was to that. Muhammad's only loss was to his ego, which, as you can tell later on, was very fragile. And this, I think, is what would seal the deal. There are plenty more we can discuss. But Paul committed even to celibacy. when he became a Christian. Not because it's required, but because he understood, much like the prophet Jeremiah before him, that traveling and having your life in danger and being always at odds with your community and of those you're trying to reach, that you don't want to drag some poor daughter of the Lord into this mess and, of course, involve your kids as well. The prophet Jeremiah committed to celibacy not because prophets can't marry, but because he was predicting the siege of Babylon. And while Jeremiah on his own could barely endure the starvation, torture, and false imprisonments he endured from his own countrymen, he did not want to, and God didn't want him to, have to endure seeing his wife ravaged by the Babylonians and his children killed by the invading armies. So when Paul committed to celibacy, that's a great personal sacrifice, especially in Jewish culture, which puts a heavy emphasis on being fruitful and multiplying, especially for rabbis. Muhammad, by extension, used his claims of prophethood to enable polygamy, which, by the way, goes beyond what he deemed lawful according to the Quran. In Surah 4, we're told that you're allowed up to 4 wives, assuming you can treat them all equally. Muhammad had up to 9 to 11 wives, according to Sahih al-Bukhari, and, of course, that was not even counting the sex slaves that he had. Including that, he justified rape, which we can note in calling women a till to plow them however and wherever you wish. He had sex slaves and promoted that practice itself. He himself participated in homosexuality and at the same time made it a capital offense. If you'd like to see more on that, note the Night of Al-Zutt, Z-U-T-T, and the very interesting exchange Muhammad had with 30 very tall black men. He committed necrophilia and affirmed this as a status for a prophet when he came to the grave of one of his relatives and slept with the corpse. And, most significantly and infamously, pedophilia, where he married the 6-year-old daughter of his friend Abu Bakr's daughter, Aisha, and consummated the marriage when she was 9. So, noting a comparison of character references, the worst thing you could say about the Apostle Paul is that, as we read most potently in Galatians, he can be somewhat sarcastic when you push him. But when it ultimately comes down to it, that's not going to make him the kind of person you would be afraid to leave alone with your 6-year-old daughter. Muhammad, to quote many wise men before me, is not the kind of person, I mean, if you could name the 10 worst things that a human being could possibly do, Muhammad did 7 to 11 of them. So that's the point that we're making here. But let's get actually into the topic, which is again addressing Muslim problems in this. The claim that Paul could corrupt the beliefs of Christianity early is a non-starter because the beliefs of Christianity were established earlier than any other religion we have on record in writing. There are no first-century documents that show Paul in conflict with early Christian teachings or evidence of conflict of doctrine between them and the apostles. All of that is either based on conjecture or assuming your conclusion before demonstrating it. In order to corrupt the beliefs of Christianity, and this is going purely on the manuscripts, he would have to have had access to all writings of Scripture to alter or censor them appropriately or completely to be in line with his ideas. If you're to say that he forged 2 Peter, you need to emphasize Paul's ability to access all copies of 2 Peter and, of course, to influence them going forward. That's not only impossible in the ancient world, but undemonstrable. And generally, if you can't prove something, you can't use it as proof. Now, there was never a time, again, where he had access to this or even reason to believe he would want to do that. Islam, on the other hand, had not one but 2 instances in history where they did exactly this. In the time, of course, of Muhammad's early companions, Uthman, according to Sahih al-Bukhari and History of al-Tabari, gathered all of the Quranic manuscripts after the Battle of Yamama, and I'm not kidding, by the way, that's what it was called, and when the majority of the reciters, those in oral tradition who had memorized the Quran, had died in battle, they needed to get a codex, a book together, so that they wouldn't lose whatever they had left. And after gathering together all of the scraps and the memories to aid and not referencing that of one of Muhammad's wives who had a written copy for some reason but was never considered for this, all of this being compiled and gathered, he still couldn't get a complete Quran, so he said to write it in the dialect of the Quraysh, and then, and I quote, burn the rest. He had the central authority. He was the third successor of Muhammad and had total authority over the Ummah, the Muslim community, and ordered the complete censorship and burning of those that didn't agree with what he put together. And we have some of Muhammad's reciters, in fact, ones that he named as the best of those whom recited, and said that these Qurans that Uthman is trying to put forward are the equivalent of deceit. And again, you can read this in the Hadith and the Sunnah. This had to happen again, unfortunately, within the last 100 and change years, when under the Ottoman Empire, the government of Cairo was giving standardized tests to its students and found that these Muslims from around the Muslim world were giving different answers on fundamental readings and teachings of the Quran, and very limited at that. So they gathered together all of the variants in Arabic, decided on the modern Hafs translation, and drowned the rest in the Nile. So by fire and water, there has been censorship of the Quran that disagrees with the central political authority. We don't know what the Quran of Muhammad's time was, but we do know what? That this censorship took place. We can't demonstrate that Paul taught contrary to Jesus. Every example of Paul teaching contrary to Jesus, or actually Jesus and Paul being in agreement with each other, and most significantly, when it comes down to it, this is putting more egg on Islam's face by bringing up these topics than Christianity when we get the chance to actually examine the history. And to rub salt in the wound even further, Islamic sources don't name Paul as the one at fault for the Bible being at odds with Islam. All Quranic sources claim that the Torah and Injil, the Old and New Testament, are perfectly in line with each other despite not. And of all those listed as Isa's apostles in one of Islam's earliest sources, not the Quran, but the biography of Ibn Ishaq, the Sunnah of Muhammad, we read the following: those whom Isa, son of Miriam, sent, both disciples and those who came after them in the land, were Peter the disciple and Paul with him. And it notes parenthetically, Paul belonged to the followers but was not a disciple to Rome. Then it goes on to mention Andrew and Matthew to the land of the cannibals, that's Africa, Thomas to the land of Babel, which is in the land of the east, Philip to Carthage in Africa, John to Ephesus, the city of the young men of the cave, James to Jerusalem, which is Aila, the city of the sanctuary, Bartholomew to Arabia, which is the land of Hijaz, Simon to the Berbers, etc., etc., etc. This is, by the way, in Ibn Ishaq's Life of Muhammad, page 653. But with all of that said, despite the fact that the accusation is made, Islam's sources would speak contrary to it, and Paul is named among one of Jesus' followers. Despite the accusation that Paul corrupted any text that disagreed with him later on, there is no instance of him being able to historically do that, whereas there are two documented examples of that taking place in Islamic history. The reason this is coming up is because Paul is at odds with Muhammad, and yet the credibility of Muhammad is nothing compared to that of the reliability of the Apostle Paul. The argument and claim that Paul's conflict with the apostles motivated him to want to be at odds with their teachings shows that it was, in fact, resolved and a non-starter. In the actual text of the apostle they claim he is at odds with. Paul writing earlier did not prevent the apostles from writing, and of course the actual instance doesn't demonstrate any conflict, though instances in which Paul claims to be teaching contrary to Jesus were actually in line with Jesus, and of course Paul distinguishes himself from the apostles and submits to their authority readily in the earliest records of Christian history. So if there's any claim of there being a problem with the reliability of the Apostle Paul, it actually ends up showing there's a serious problem with the reliability of Islam. So when it comes down to it, be careful what you criticize, because it might in fact reveal more skeletons in your closet and show that ours are clean.